The night the Duke of Ashworth was ruined, it rained so hard the gutters ran black. Eleanor Wynne heard about it the way everyone in London heard about it. Second-hand, over breakfast, from a woman who had heard it from a woman who had heard it from someone who claimed to have been present in the House of Lords when it happened. Mrs. Cavendish, Eleanor's late husband's aunt, delivered the news between bites of toast with the cheerful authority of a woman who considers gossip a public service, and by the time she had finished, the tea had gone cold and the toast had gone soft, and Eleanor had formed precisely no opinion, which was unusual in a city where everyone had formed one by dawn. The facts, as they were understood by the newspapers, and therefore by everyone, were these: that the 6th Duke of Ashworth had been publicly accused on the floor of the House of Lords, and with the particular relish that attends the destruction of the powerful, of having defrauded the shareholders of the Dorian Canal Company of some £47,000. That the man making the accusation was Lord Ravelston, his own cousin, his late father's ward, the man he had raised from a boy of 12 to a gentleman of independent means and a seat in Parliament. That the documents Ravelston produced, account ledgers, signed authorizations, a letter in what appeared to be Ashworth's own hand, were damning in their specificity. And that Ashworth, who could have spoken, who could have raged, who could have called his cousin a liar on the floor of that ancient chamber, had instead said nothing at all, had sat perfectly still, with what one observer described as a stony expression, and another, more perceptive, described as the particular stillness of a man calculating how many people he can protect if he simply absorbs the blow himself. And then he had risen and walked out, and the doors had closed behind him. "Dreadful," Mrs. Cavendish said, reaching for the marmalade. "Though I must say, dukes do fall more dramatically than other men. It is one of their few reliable qualities." Eleanor said nothing. She was reading the newspaper account, not the breathless front-page summary, which told her what London thought had happened, but the smaller column on the 3rd page that reprinted the actual figures from the Canal Company accounts. She read them twice. She put down the paper. "The numbers don't make sense," she said. "They never do, dear. That is what numbers are for." "No, I mean they actually don't make sense. The disbursement pattern is wrong. If the Duke was stealing from the company, the withdrawals would correlate with his known expenditures. They don't. They correlate with nothing I can identify, which means either the money went somewhere that isn't in these accounts, or the person spending it wasn't the person these accounts are meant to implicate." Mrs. Cavendish looked at her over the marmalade with the expression she reserved for moments when Eleanor's mind moved faster than polite society considered appropriate. "Eleanor, it is 8:30 in the morning." "Yes?" "And you have just forensically analyzed a duke's financial fraud from a newspaper column over breakfast. The column is quite detailed." "That is not the point I was making." Eleanor folded the paper and set it beside her plate. She did not think about the Duke of Ashworth again that day, or the next. She filed the observation the way she filed all observations, precisely, without interpretation, in the part of her mind that collected things that did not add up, and held them until they did. London, meanwhile, made its judgments with the speed and enthusiasm it reserved for the destruction of those it had previously elevated. Within a week, the practical consequences had materialized with the efficiency of a siege. His membership at White's was not revoked, nothing so crude, but his usual table was somehow always occupied. His seat on the board of the Metropolitan Hospital was politely made available. 3 dinner invitations were withdrawn, then 7, then all of them. His solicitor wrote to express deep personal regard and an unfortunate inability to continue representation, which was the longest and most expensive way anyone had yet found to say, "I cannot afford to be seen with you."
Eleanor heard the updates from Mrs. Cavendish, who received them from the network of elderly women who constitute London's true intelligence service. More efficient than any newspaper, more thorough than any police force, and operating on a budget consisting entirely of tea and biscuits. She heard that the Duke's house in Grosvenor Square had gone very quiet, that his staff had remained, Mrs. Aldridge, the housekeeper, who had been there since the old Duke's time, and who operated on the principle that loyalty was not a sentiment but a professional standard, continued to manage the household with the same efficiency she had maintained through 2 dukes, 1 funeral, 3 scandals of lesser magnitude, and the 17-day period in 1841 when the second footman had developed an unfortunate attachment to gin. The house functioned. It simply no longer had anyone to function for. What was known about the Duke of Ashworth, known publicly, which is to say superficially and with great confidence, was this. He was 41, tall in the way that people who have been tall since boyhood sometimes are, slightly apologetic about it, as though he had spent decades adjusting his posture to avoid towering over people he was trying to put at ease. He had grey at his temples that had arrived at 36. He dressed well because his valet dressed him well. He spoke carefully because he had learned, early and at some cost, that careless words from powerful mouths land on other people's lives like stones dropped from a height. He had been Duke since 23, when his father had died halfway through a parliamentary session, and 3 weeks before his only son's wedding. The wedding had been postponed, then abandoned when the bride's family discovered that the old Duke's estate, magnificent in acreage, was rather less magnificent in liquid funds. Those who knew Ashworth at the time said he had not appeared to blame them. He had spent the next 18 years restoring the estate, managing 3,000 acres in Northumberland, providing for 42 tenant families, and raising his orphaned cousin with steady, unsentimental care. He had done all of this competently and alone. And now Ravelston, whom he had taught to ride, whose debts he had paid twice without comment, had stood up in the one place where a lie carries the force of law, and said the words that emptied every room Ashworth entered. Those closest to him, his valet, Mr. Marsh, who had served him 11 years, and Mrs. Aldridge, who saw the accounts that crossed his desk in the days after. These few understood, or suspected, what the silence contained. Not guilt. The deliberate choice to absorb a false accusation rather than expose the truth about Ravelston's finances, Ravelston's gambling, Ravelston's systematic embezzlement. Truth that would have destroyed not only Ravelston, but his wife, his 2 small children, and the remnants of a family bond Ashworth could not bring himself to sever. "He has no wife," Mrs. Cavendish reported one afternoon, with the air of a woman delivering a diagnosis. "No children. No one, apparently, who might speak for him. He has a valet and a housekeeper and 3,000 acres of Northumberland moorland, and that is the full inventory of his personal life. It is the saddest thing I have heard this week, and I heard on Tuesday that Mrs. Barlow's cat has died." Eleanor, who was mending a stocking, said, "The cat or the Duke?" "Both, I should think." That evening, alone in her room, Eleanor took out the newspaper she had saved and read the column again. The numbers still did not make sense. They had not rearranged themselves into a pattern of guilt during the 2 weeks she had left them alone. If anything, the longer she looked, the more clearly she could see the shape of something that was not fraud by the Duke of Ashworth, but fraud against him. A careful, systematic, almost elegant construction designed to implicate one man by hiding the actions of another. She could not prove this from a newspaper column. She would need the actual accounts. She put the paper away and did not think about it again until 3 days later,
When Mrs. Cavendish mentioned over breakfast, with the particular casualness that indicated she had been waiting for precisely the right moment, that she had a godson, and the godson had a wife, and the wife had a sister married to a man named Foyle, and Foyle had recently been appointed steward of the Ashworth London properties, and Foyle was in desperate need of someone who could make sense of a set of account books that appeared to have been kept by a man whose relationship with arithmetic was, at best, adversarial. Eleanor looked at Mrs. Cavendish. Mrs. Cavendish looked at her toast. "You planned this," Eleanor said.
I have no idea what you mean.
"You have been waiting to mention Foyle until I had read the accounts in the paper and come to my own conclusions, and was precisely ready to hear that someone needed help with exactly the kind of problem I cannot resist." Mrs. Cavendish took a delicate bite of toast. "I have always said you were the cleverest woman I know, Eleanor. It is both your finest quality and your most exhausting one." Eleanor said yes. She said yes because she was bored, because the pension was adequate but not generous, because the puzzle of disordered accounts appealed to the part of her mind that preferred problems with answers. She did not say yes because of the Duke of Ashworth. She thought about numbers that did not make sense, and the particular satisfying feeling of making them make sense, which was the closest thing to peace she had found in the 3 years since Thomas died.
She did not know, could not have known, that she was walking into a house where a man had been standing alone for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to be seen. She did not know that the accounts would tell her not just a story of fraud, but a story of sacrifice. She did not know that the simple act of reading numbers with honest eyes would begin something that neither of them had planned, and neither of them could afford, and neither of them would be able to stop. But that is getting ahead of the story, and this story does not rush. Dear readers and listeners, welcome, especially if this is your first evening here with us. This is a place for stories that make you feel something real. Stories of love that builds itself slowly from ordinary materials, patience, respect, the courage of showing up on difficult days. Stories of women whose strength is practical and men whose goodness is quiet, and the strange, unmappable territory between two people who did not plan on mattering to each other. If you are here for the first time, I'm glad you found us. If you are returning, I'm glad you came back. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight. I read every single one, and I promise you, each one matters. If you have not yet, subscribing costs nothing and means everything to this small, growing corner of the world. Now, let us return to London and to the autumn of 1849. Eleanor Wynne was not the kind of woman anyone would have expected to alter the course of a duke's life, which is precisely why she was suited to do it. She was 34, a widow of 3 years. She had married Thomas Wynne at 26, late by the standards of her mother's generation, and deliberately by her own. Thomas had been a naval surgeon, clever and kind, and possessed of the specific, dependable steadiness that some women mistake for dullness, and Eleanor had recognized, correctly, as the rarest thing a man can offer. The willingness to be ordinary and present and consistent without requiring applause for it. They had had 7 years. 7 good years in which the small daily acts of marriage, the shared tea, the argument about the leaking window, the way he read aloud to her from his medical journals because he had noticed she was interested, had accumulated into something solid and quietly irreplaceable. And then Thomas had died of a fever contracted from a patient in the charity ward, where he volunteered on Thursday afternoons, because that was, in his view, what doctors were for. He died on a Tuesday. Eleanor buried him on a Friday, and she spent the next 3 years learning the particular arithmetic of grief. Not the dramatic mathematics of collapse, but the small, relentless subtraction of ordinary moments. The chair empty at breakfast. The front door that no longer means anything. The discovery that the world requires you to keep functioning, even when a fundamental part of your machinery has been removed. She had not collapsed. She had not retreated. She had done what she had always done, which was to assess the situation, identify what was required, and proceed. She had settled Thomas's modest debts, managed the pension, taken over the household accounts that Mrs. Cavendish, who was 73 and cheerfully innumerate, had been managing through a system best described as optimistic approximation. She had chopped wood when the delivery was late and replaced a broken window latch with her own hands and a borrowed set of tools, to the visible alarm of the neighbor who watched from across the street, and the invisible satisfaction of Eleanor, who considered the ability to fix things one had not broken to be among the more useful human qualities. She had made herself useful because usefulness was the only currency she had ever fully trusted, and because the alternative, sitting in a quiet house with nothing between herself and the full weight of Thomas's absence, was not something she could afford. She was not beautiful in the way that word is generally deployed in stories like this one. She was striking, which is a different thing, and in many ways a more dangerous one. She had dark hair that she wore simply, brown eyes that paid close attention, and a face that was more interesting than pretty. The kind of face that improves the longer you look at it, which is the opposite of what fashion requires, and exactly what permanence rewards. She dressed plainly, in dark colors that Thomas's aunt considered appropriate and Eleanor considered practical, and she moved through the world with the quiet, purposeful efficiency of someone who has too much to do to worry about how she looks while doing it. She began work at Ashworth House on a grey morning in late October, in a small office at the back that smelled of dust and old ink, and the faint, permanent chill of rooms that faced north and are rarely occupied. Foyle brought the books. Eleanor brought her own pencils, sharpened to a specific point that Thomas had always teased her about, and the small notebook in which she recorded observations in a hand so precise it could have been typeset. She did not expect to meet the Duke. He kept to the East Wing and the library, and did not generally encounter temporary consultants engaged to sort out the mess his cousin had made of his finances. She did not meet him on the first day, or the second. She met the accounts, which confirmed and deepened her breakfast suspicion. Not merely disordered, but deliberately obscured. Entries that almost balanced, but did not quite. Payments to companies that existed on paper, but not in any trade directory she could find. A pattern of small, regular withdrawals disguised as maintenance costs for properties that, when she checked against Foyle's records, had not required maintenance at all. Whoever had constructed this system had understood that the most effective fraud is the boring kind. The kind that hides in ordinary columns, where no one thinks to look because the numbers are too small and too tedious to examine individually. She met him on the third day. She had stayed later than intended. The light in the north-facing office was poor by 4 o'clock, and she had lit the lamp on the desk and continued working because she was close to something. A pattern in the withdrawals that suggested not one period of fraud, but two, with a gap between them that corresponded, she thought, with a period when the previous steward had been away from London. She was so absorbed that she did not hear the door, and she did not register the presence of another person in the room until she became aware of breathing that was not her own, and looked up, and found the Duke of Ashworth standing in the doorway. He was taller than she had expected. That was her first thought, which was useless, and she noted its uselessness and moved past it. He was wearing a dark coat, no cravat, his shirt open at the collar, in the way of a man who has stopped expecting visitors. His hair needed cutting. His eyes, grey, the colour of the sky outside the window, were looking at her with an expression she would later describe to Mrs. Cavendish as the way a man looks at a piece of furniture he did not order and cannot account for. "You are Mrs. Wynne," he said, not a question. "I am." "Foyle mentioned you. He said you were examining the accounts." "I am." "And what have you found?" She considered him, the controlled stillness of his posture, the careful economy of his words, the way he held himself in the doorway as though he had not quite decided whether to enter the room or retreat from it. She thought about what she had found in the accounts, which implicated not him, but someone very close to him, and which she was not yet prepared to discuss until she was certain. "I have found," she said, "that your previous steward was either very careless or very clever, and I have not yet determined which." Something moved in his expression, not a smile, but a shift, a slight alteration in the geography of his face that suggested she had said something he had not expected, and that the unexpectedness was not unwelcome. "Most people," he said, "have already determined which." "Most people," Eleanor said, "have not read the accounts." He looked at her with a quality of attention she recognized because it was the same she brought to her own examinations. Not warmth, not hostility, but the focused gaze of someone genuinely trying to see what is in front of them rather than what they expected to find. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then he inclined his head, stepped back from the doorway, and left without another word. That evening, Mrs. Cavendish pressed for details beyond what Eleanor had already offered about the house, the office, the work itself. Eleanor, after a pause that was slightly longer than the question warranted, said he seemed like a man carrying something heavy, and that she had not yet determined what it was. "You paused," said Mrs. Cavendish. "I was thinking." "You were thinking about a handsome duke, which is a kind of thinking, certainly, but not the kind you mean." Within a week, Eleanor had established a routine the household absorbed with the quiet efficiency of an organism adapting to a new element. She arrived at 8:30. She worked until noon, took tea in the small office, brought by a housemaid named Sarah, who was 19 and visibly curious about the woman who sat among the Duke's papers with such concentrated calm, and then worked until 4 or 8:30, depending on the light and the complexity of what she was untangling. She spoke to Foyle daily. She spoke to the Duke not at all. And yet she was aware of him, not in the way that awareness is usually described in stories of this kind, not as a physical pull or a romantic preoccupation, but as an ambient presence, a specific quality in the atmosphere of the house that she could not quite define, but could not ignore. She heard his footsteps in the corridor outside her office, measured and deliberate, always at the same times. 9 o'clock going toward the library, 12:30 going toward the dining room, 4 o'clock going toward the east wing. She heard, once, the low murmur of his voice speaking to someone on the stairs, and noted that it was quieter than she expected, and steadier, and that whoever he was speaking to received his full attention because the conversation was unhurried, despite the fact that she could tell, from the rhythm of his sentences, that he had somewhere else to be. She noticed that a book she had mentioned to Foyle, a volume on double-entry bookkeeping methods that she needed for cross-referencing, appeared on her desk the following morning without comment or note. She noticed that the fire in her office, which had been adequate but not generous on her first days, was now built higher and maintained more frequently, and that this change coincided precisely with the Duke's discovery that someone was working in that room, and that this someone worked best when she was not cold. She noticed these things, because noticing was what she did. She filed them without interpretation.
She continued with the accounts. What the accounts told her, as the days accumulated into weeks and October thinned into November, confirmed and deepened her breakfast analysis into something far more detailed and far more troubling. The fraud was real. £47,000 had indeed been diverted from the Dorian Canal Company. But the trail, when followed with the particular patience that Eleanor brought to columns of figures, did not lead to the Duke of Ashworth. It led, in a series of careful, concealed steps, to his cousin. Lord Ravelston had been siphoning funds for nearly 2 years, using a series of shell companies and falsified invoices that were competent enough to fool a cursory examination, but could not withstand the kind of detailed, cross-referenced analysis that Eleanor was now conducting with the methodical thoroughness of someone pulling threads from a tapestry and laying them out, one by one, until the pattern beneath became unmistakable. The letter in Ashworth's hand, the one Ravelston had produced in the House of Lords, was genuine, but its context was false. Ashworth had signed an authorization for a legitimate canal company expenditure. Ravelston had reused that signature, attaching it to a different document through a method that was clever enough to fool the Lords, but would not, Eleanor suspected, fool a competent forgery examiner with access to the original paperwork, which she now had. She also found something else. A payment, made the week after the public accusation, from Ashworth's personal funds to a trust established in the names of Ravelston's 2 children. She stared at that entry for a long time. Then she closed the ledger and pressed her fingers against the bridge of her nose and sat very still, because what she had found in the numbers was not a number at all, but a piece of a person, laid bare in columns and sums that were never meant to be read with this much care. She found him in the library on the 4th week's Tuesday, which she would later think of as the day things shifted. Not dramatically, not with any single decisive moment, but in the way that light shifts when clouds move, gradually and then all at once, until you realize you are standing in a different quality of day than the one you woke up in. She had come to ask about a specific entry, a payment to a firm called Blackett & Sons, that appeared in both the Canal Company records and the household accounts, and which she needed clarified. The library was large and cold, and filled with the particular silence of a room that contains more books than it has ever contained readers. Ashworth was standing by the window, one hand on the frame, watching a woman walk a small, irritable dog in the rain. He did not turn when she entered. She waited. She watched the line of his shoulders and understood that he had heard her and was giving himself a moment before he composed whatever face he intended to show her. "Blackett & Sons," she said, without preamble, because she had learned in their brief exchanges that he preferred directness to ceremony, and that the fastest way to earn his attention was to demonstrate that she was not wasting it. "They appear 4 times in the canal accounts and twice in the household ledger. In the canal accounts they are listed as engineering consultants. In the household ledger they are listed as providers of building materials. They cannot be both." He turned. His face had composed itself into its usual controlled neutrality, but his eyes had not quite caught up. There was something in them that was not neutrality, something that looked, for the briefest moment, like the expression of a man who has been alone in a room for a very long time and has just heard another voice. "They are neither," he said. "Blackett & Sons is a solicitor's office in Newcastle that handles property transfers. My cousin used the name to disguise payments to himself." "You know this?" "I know this." "You have known this for some time?" "Yes." She stood very still, the way she stood when she was processing something that required her full attention. And she looked at him, and she asked the question that no one in London had thought to ask, because everyone in London had already decided on the answer. Why did you not say so? She watched him decide whether to tell the truth to someone he barely knew. She could see it in the way his hand tightened on the window frame, the way his jaw shifted almost imperceptibly, the way his gaze moved from her face to the rain and back.
"Because," he said, slowly, carefully, as though he were placing each word on a scale and checking its weight. "If I had spoken, the truth would have destroyed not only my cousin, but his wife and his 2 children, who are 4 and 6, and who call me Uncle Edward, and who have done nothing wrong." That is either very noble or very foolish. It is neither. It is arithmetic. And there, in that word, that precise, unromantic, almost clinical word, Eleanor recognized a mind that worked the way hers did. "Your arithmetic has a flaw," she said. "Does it? You have not counted yourself among the people who are harmed." Something happened to his face. A fracture, hairline and quickly repaired, like a crack in ice that freezes over almost before you can see it. He turned back to the window. The woman with the irritable dog had gone. "No," he said. "I have not." She left the library without another word, because she understood that what had just passed between them was more than he had said to anyone in weeks, possibly months, and that to stay would be to ask for more than he was ready to give. She went back to her office and sat down, and her hands were not entirely steady. She pressed them flat against the desk, held them there until the tremor passed, and then picked up her pencil, because the work was the thing she could do, and the other thing she could not. Not yet. After that, the quality of their interactions shifted in a way that was invisible to anyone who was not paying the very closest attention, and blindingly obvious to anyone who was. Mrs. Aldridge was paying attention. So was Foyle. So was Sarah, the housemaid, who reported to the kitchen with a frequency that suggested her interest in the situation had outpaced her professional discretion. The Duke, who had for weeks inhabited his own house like a ghost, present but unconnected, moving through rooms without occupying them, began to inhabit it differently. He appeared at meals. He sat in the library with the door open rather than closed. He was seen, on one notable occasion, in the kitchen at 7:30 in the morning, making tea with his own hands. Not because the staff were unavailable, but because, as Mrs. Aldridge later reconstructed the event with the forensic precision of a woman who had managed households for 30 years, he had come downstairs early and had passed the small office where Mrs. Wynne worked, and had noticed that she was already there at her desk, and that her lamp was lit, but no tea had been brought, and that this was an oversight he intended to correct personally. He brought her the tea. She accepted it without comment, as though dukes regularly appeared in back offices at 7:30 with cups of tea they had made themselves, and said thank you and returned to her work. And he stood for a moment in the doorway in which she had first appeared, and which had become, without either of them planning it, the specific geographical feature of their growing acquaintance, and then went to the library. He began asking her questions beyond the accounts. Had she read a particular essay on agricultural reform that he had found interesting? Did she think the new rail line to the north would affect tenant farmers' markets? What was her opinion on the Bank Charter Act? He asked these questions with the careful casualness of a man who is pretending that the answers do not matter to him, and Eleanor answered them with the careful thoroughness of a woman who is pretending that the attention does not matter to her. One morning, he brought the estate's Northumberland maps, not because she had asked, but because a conversation about soil drainage 2 days prior had included a question she could not answer without seeing the topography. He unrolled the maps on her desk and stood beside her and pointed to the fell where the winter runoff caused flooding every March, and to the valley where the tenant farms clustered along the river. And his voice, when he spoke about the land, was different from his voice in all other contexts. Warmer, more specific. The voice of a man describing the one thing in his life he loved without reservation. "The soil on the North Fell is thin," he said. "It remembers every hard winter. But the farms in the valley have 3 feet of alluvial loam, which is the kind of forgiveness that takes centuries to build." Eleanor looked at the map. She looked at his hand on the map, the long fingers, the specific way he traced the river's path, and something shifted in her chest that she did not examine and did not intend to. "You should show me the tenancy agreements," she said, because practical requests were still the only language she trusted herself to speak. Something moved behind his eyes. The expression of a man who has just been offered trust in the specific currency he values most, which is the currency of being taken seriously. "Yes," he said, "I will." By November's end, he was consulting her on estate correspondence. He brought letters to the small office, tenant requests, agent reports, legal queries about property boundaries disputed since the previous century, and he sat in the chair across from her desk, the chair that had appeared one morning without explanation and that everyone in the household understood was his. And they worked. Not side by side, across from each other, but together nonetheless, on the practical, unglamorous business of keeping an ancient obligation alive when the world had decided its keeper was not worth trusting. He deferred to her judgment on the accounts without ceremony, simply accepting her figures and her analysis, with the confidence of a man who recognizes competence because he values it above all other qualities. And Eleanor discovered what it felt like to be useful to someone who saw exactly what she was doing and understood exactly what it cost. The first crack came on a Thursday evening in mid-November, and it came, as such things often do, through a child. Eleanor had stayed late, later than usual, because she was close to completing the full reconstruction of Ravelston's fraud and wanted to finish the final column of cross-references before she lost the thread. It was past 6 when she gathered her papers, and the house had taken on the particular quality of a large building at nightfall. Shadows deepening in the corridors, the distant sound of the kitchen preparing dinner, the smell of wood smoke and beeswax that was Ashworth House's specific domestic signature. She was walking toward the front hall when she heard a sound that stopped her. Crying. High, thin, exhausted. The crying of a small child who has been crying for some time and has passed through the dramatic phase into the desolate one, where the tears are no longer a demand, but a condition. A state of being that the child has given up hope of anyone resolving. She followed the sound down a corridor she had not previously entered, past the dining room, and through a door that opened onto a smaller passage, and then into a room that was clearly a nursery, though not a recently occupied one. The curtains were heavy and old, the wallpaper faded, the rocking horse in the corner thick with dust. And in the center of the room, sitting on the floor with his back against an ancient settee, and a very small child in his arms, was the Duke of Ashworth. The child was perhaps 2 years old, a girl with dark curls and a red, furious, tear-streaked face, and the absolute commitment to unhappiness that only very small children can achieve. She was wearing a nightgown that was too large for her, and had a woolen rabbit clutched in one fist, with the grip of someone defending a sovereign territory. She was sobbing into Ashworth's shirt front, and Ashworth was holding her with both arms, one hand cupped behind her head, rocking steadily, murmuring something too quiet for Eleanor to hear. Eleanor stood in the doorway. She did not speak. She watched. She watched the way he held the child, not awkwardly, not uncertainly, but with the practiced competence of someone who has done this before, who knows the exact pressure and rhythm that a small body needs, who understands that a child in this state cannot be reasoned with or distracted, but only held, steadily, until the storm passes. She watched his face, which was unguarded in a way she had never seen it, the careful control entirely absent, replaced by something she did not yet have a name for, and which she suspected he did not know he was wearing. The child's crying began to ease. The sobs became hiccups. The small body relaxed against his chest in increments, like a fist slowly opening. Ashworth continued to rock, continued to murmur, and Eleanor heard now fragments of what he was saying. Not shushing, not scolding, but a low, steady narration of absolutely nothing. There. Yes, I know. The world is very large and very loud, and you are very small and very tired, and that is a perfectly reasonable thing to cry about. I would cry about it too if I thought anyone would hold me. The child gave a final, shuddering sigh and went still. Not asleep, but past the crisis, resting against him with the boneless trust that children give to the people they have decided are safe. Ashworth lifted his head and saw Eleanor in the doorway. His face was still open. He had not had time to close it. "This is Clara," he said. "She is Ravelston's daughter. She and her brother have been staying here for some weeks. Since the scandal. Since Ravelston's wife, overwhelmed and furious, had sent the children to the one person she knew would not turn them away, even though that person was the same man her husband had publicly destroyed. Eleanor understood this without being told, and Ashworth saw that she understood. "She has nightmares," he said. "The nurse is competent, but Clara does not want the nurse at night. She wants—" He stopped. The child stirred against his chest. He adjusted his hold with the automatic precision of long practice. "She wants someone she knows." "She knows you," Eleanor said. "Yes." "How often?" "Most nights." Eleanor looked at him, sitting on the floor of a dusty nursery, holding his betrayer's daughter against his chest, having answered her nightmares most nights for weeks, telling no one, asking nothing for it. "You should eat something," she said. The way she said it, quietly, practically, with the specific directness of someone who has decided that another person's soft neglect is no longer acceptable, made him look at her with an expression that seemed to cost him something. "Yes," he said. "I probably should." She walked home through dark streets and went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and pressed her hands together very tightly against her mouth and stayed like that until the pressure subsided. It took longer than she would have liked. Clara attached herself to Eleanor with the swift, unquestioning trust that young children extend to people who treat them as real. This happened on a Tuesday, when Eleanor encountered Clara in the hallway, crying over a wooden block that had rolled under a cabinet, and retrieved it without fuss, and without the patronizing brightness that adults often deploy toward children. And Clara had looked at her, with her dark, serious eyes, and said, "Thank you," with the grave formality of a duchess. And that had been that. After Tuesday, Clara sought Eleanor out. She brought her things, a feather, a button, a stone from the garden that was grey and smooth, and unremarkable in every way except that Clara had chosen it, and presented them with the solemn ceremony of a diplomat bearing gifts. She sat on Eleanor's lap while Eleanor worked, examining the account books with a focused, incomprehending concentration that mirrored Eleanor's own expression so precisely that Foyle, passing the open door, had to look away
because the lump in his throat was interfering with his professional dignity. And Clara's brother James, who was 4, and who had the same dark eyes as his sister, and the additional quality of a 4-year-old's devastating observational honesty, said one evening at supper, looking from Ashworth to Eleanor and back again, with the expression of someone solving a puzzle the adults have made unnecessarily complicated. "You are always in the same room now." Neither Eleanor nor Ashworth responded. But later, in the library, after the children were in bed, Ashworth said, without looking up from his book, "He is not wrong." And Eleanor, also without looking up from her book, said, "No, he is not." December arrived with a hard frost that rimed the windows of Ashworth House each morning and turned the square's garden into something sharp and glittering in the early light. Eleanor continued to come each day, though her formal work on the accounts was nearing completion. There were, she told herself, additional records to organize, filing to complete, a system to establish for Foyle's future reference. These were real tasks. There were also insufficient explanations for the regularity of her attendance, and she knew this, and she did not examine it, and she kept coming. The household had shifted around them with the organic intelligence of people attuned to the emotional weather of the house they inhabit. Mrs. Aldridge set a second place at the small table in the morning room, without being asked, on the day she observed that the Duke and Mrs. Wynne had taken to drinking their tea in the same room at the same time, while discussing the same newspaper. The cook began preparing a midday meal for 2 rather than 1. Sarah brought winter flowers for the small office. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to make the north-facing room feel like a place someone was expected and welcome, rather than merely tolerated. Eleanor learned, through Foyle, that the scandal had cost Ashworth not only his reputation, but a substantial portion of his income. Worthless canal shares, expensive legal defense. Through Mrs. Aldridge, that he had quietly reduced his personal expenditure to the minimum, redirecting the savings to the estate and Ravelston's Children's Trust. Through Marsh, who had decided she needed to hear it, that Ashworth had not slept through the night in 7 weeks, waking at 3 or 4 each morning for Clara, then working until dawn. "He will not stop on his own," Marsh said. He was a lean, quiet man, with the economical manner of someone who considers words a finite resource. "He does not know how." "What are you asking me to do?" Eleanor said. Marsh looked at her with an expression that combined professional discretion and personal urgency in equal measure. "I'm not asking you to do anything, Mrs. Wynne. I'm telling you what I have observed, and trusting your judgment to determine what, if anything, is to be done about it." "That," Eleanor said, "is asking." "Yes," Marsh said. "I suppose it is." One evening, after the children were in bed, Eleanor found a letter on the table beside her nursery chair. Old, its folds soft with handling, addressed in a hand she did not recognize. She opened it, thinking it misfiled, and read the first line. "My dear Edward, I am writing this because I find I cannot say it, and because I suspect that by the time you read it, I would have lost the courage that writing in the small hours seems to provide." It was from Ashworth's mother. Written, Eleanor judged from the date, when Ashworth was perhaps 10 or 11. A letter full of specific observations, the kind only a parent who watches closely would know. That he lined up his toy soldiers not by regiment, but by some private ranking system of his own devising. That he gave away his pudding to the kitchen boy with an air of great secrecy, as though generosity was something to be hidden. That he had his father's stubbornness, and her own tendency to carry other people's worries as personal responsibility. "I worry," she wrote, "that you will spend your life holding everyone else up, and forget that someone must hold you. Eleanor read the letter twice. She placed it exactly where she had found it. She went to the library, where he was standing at the window, in the way he stood when he was trying to be alone without leaving the room. "I found your mother's letter," she said. His hand tightened on the window frame. "Yes," he said. "She was right." He said nothing. Snow, which had begun that afternoon, fell past the window in slow, heavy flakes that caught the lamplight. "She was right," Eleanor said again, more quietly. Then she left. She presented her full findings on a Friday afternoon in early December. The light was dying. Snow had been threatening all day, the sky pressing down on the rooftops, the air holding its breath. She laid the report on the library table, 37 pages, bound with string, every figure verified and cross-referenced, and she stood back and waited while he read. He read slowly. He turned pages with the specific attention of a man who understands what he is looking at and is reading for confirmation rather than information. The fire crackled. The snow began, the first flakes drifting past the glass. He reached the final page and sat very still for a long moment. Then he closed the report and looked at her. "You have been very thorough," he said. "I have been accurate," she said. "Thoroughness is a method. Accuracy is a result." "Mrs. Wynne, this report would clear my name." "Yes." "And destroy my cousin." "Yes." "And his wife. And his children." "His children," Eleanor said, "who sleep in your house and cry for you at night." "Yes." The silence that followed was the longest they had shared. The snow fell. The fire settled. Somewhere in the house, Clara laughed. The high, clear, uncomplicated laugh of a child who has no idea that the adults around her are balanced on the edge of a decision that will determine the shape of several lives. "I cannot use this," he said. "I know." "You knew before you wrote it." "I knew before I started." "Then why did you write it?" "Because you deserved to have someone believe you," she said, "even if no one else ever sees it." The snow fell for 3 days. London softened under white. Eleanor continued to come each day, though her formal work was complete. There were records to organize, she told herself. There was foil to train. There were the children. On a January evening, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, and the fire was burning low in the library, Eleanor fell asleep in her chair. She woke to find a blanket over her that had not been there before, the fire built up, and a cup of tea on the table beside her, still warm, covered with a saucer to keep the heat in. The room was empty. The blanket was the one that usually lived on the back of Ashworth's own chair. She sat holding the tea in both hands, feeling the warmth of it through her fingers, and she thought about the series of actions the blanket and the fire and the covered saucer represented. A man standing, crossing the room, removing the blanket from his own chair, spreading it over her, carefully enough not to wake her, building the fire, making tea, covering it, leaving so she could wake without awkwardness, even his tenderness structured to protect her autonomy. She walked home through streets bright with frost. Halfway down Wimpole Street, she stopped on the pavement, pressed her fingers against her eyes, and stood very still until she could breathe evenly again. Then she sat on her bed in the dark and thought about Thomas. Not about Thomas as grief, but about Thomas as the man he had been, who had loved her and wanted her to be happy, and who would have said, "You are alive, Eleanor." Christmas came, and with it a transformation. Mrs. Aldridge outdid herself. Garlands, candles, an enormous tree that required 4 staff and a system of ropes, decorated by Clara and James with the focused anarchic energy of small children given free access to glass ornaments and a limited understanding of gravity. Eleanor arrived at noon in a dark green dress that Mrs. Cavendish had insisted upon, and that Eleanor had resisted, and then not resisted. She brought a wooden puzzle for James, a doll for Clara, excellent sherry for Mrs. Aldridge that was received with the focused appreciation of a connoisseur. For Ashworth, she brought a book, a volume on northern agricultural methods, annotated in the margins by a previous owner whose handwriting suggested a practical farmer, and his observations were specific, experienced, and occasionally profane. She had chosen it because it was relevant to his estate. She had chosen it because the annotations were the kind of thing that might make him smile. She had chosen it because a book is a gift that says, "I have been paying attention to what matters to you," without saying anything else. And she was not yet prepared to say anything else. He received it with both hands. He turned it over. He opened it to a random page, read the annotation there, and something happened to his face that Eleanor had never seen before, and that she immediately, fiercely, wanted to see again. It was a smile, not the careful arrangement of features that passed for social pleasantness in the world he inhabited, but a real smile, sudden and undefended, and so transforming that for a moment he looked like a different man entirely. "This is," he began, and stopped and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Wynne." "Eleanor," she said. She had not planned to say it. Clara, on the floor with her new doll, said without looking up, "I know, you said." And James, examining his puzzle with the grave concentration of a future engineer, added, "Uncle Edward calls you Mrs. Wynne, but his face does Eleanor." Eleanor felt heat rise from her collar to her temples. Ashworth was looking at James with an expression that combined mortification, helpless amusement, and something he was making no attempt to disguise, possibly because the attempt had become too expensive. "His face does Eleanor," Mrs. Aldridge repeated to the kitchen that evening with satisfaction. After Christmas, Eleanor read to Clara and James most evenings in the nursery. Fairy tales, adventure stories, a natural history James loved for its pictures of improbable animals. Ashworth sat in the opposite chair and listened. One evening she glanced up mid-sentence and found him looking at her and Clara with an expression that made her lose her place and have to start the sentence over, which Clara noticed, and James did not, which meant that Clara patted Eleanor's hand with the reassuring confidence of a child who believes adults occasionally need help, and Eleanor continued reading, and her voice was not entirely steady for the rest of the page. February brought Ravelston. He arrived on a Thursday without warning, handsome, fair-haired, well-dressed, with the polished manner Eleanor recognized immediately as charm that costs nothing because it is manufactured. He swept into Ashworth House with the easy confidence of a man returning to a place he considered his own, greeted the staff by name, told Mrs. Aldridge she looked younger every time he saw her, which Mrs. Aldridge received with the expression of a woman being offered counterfeit currency by someone who should know she can spot the difference. Eleanor was in the library when she heard his voice, bright, carrying, performatively warm. She closed her book and did not leave. He found her 20 minutes later. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her with the evaluating gaze of a man who has correctly identified something he did not expect and is not pleased about. "You must be Mrs. Wynne, my cousin's new, what shall we call it, secretary?" "You may call it whatever you like. I answer to Mrs. Wynne." "I understand you have been helping with the accounts. That is very good of you. My cousin is fortunate to have such devoted assistance. Eleanor regarded him with the same focused attention she brought to columns that did not add up. He is, and the accounts are in excellent order now. Every transaction documented, every payment traced, every discrepancy identified and sourced. Something behind his smile shifted. "How thorough," he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Isn't it?" Over the days that followed, Eleanor watched Ravelston the way she watched accounts, noting what was said, unsaid, performed, and what leaked through the performance. He wanted money. The trust fund Ashworth controlled for his children, which his gambling debts made urgent. He wanted control. The canal investigation had not formally concluded, and he needed Eleanor's evidence to stay buried. He played with his children genuinely enough, in the way of a man who enjoys the performance of fatherhood, without submitting to its daily, unglamorous demands. He had never been present for one of Clara's nightmares. He deferred to Ashworth in company with convincing warmth. But Eleanor read him, in the way his eyes moved to the desk where papers were stacked, in the questions he asked the staff about where documents were kept, in the way his fingers trailed along shelves and drawer handles with the absent, acquisitive gesture of a man taking inventory. One evening, when Ravelston was supposedly out, Eleanor passed the ground floor study and heard his voice, pleasant, reasonable, with something harder underneath. He was asking Foyle about Eleanor's report, asking with the specific, detailed interest of a man who knows what he is looking for and is running out of time. She stepped into the doorway. Foyle looked relieved. Ravelston rearranged his expression from calculation to warmth. "Mrs. Wynne, just asking about some old files. Family papers. Sentimental value." "Of course. Though I should mention that all documents pertaining to the estate and canal accounts have been catalogued and secured. By me. Personally. The index is quite detailed." She paused. "Every page accounted for." The silence was brief and significant. Ravelston's smile held, but his eyes recognized that he was dealing with someone who could not be charmed, intimidated, or maneuvered around. "How efficient," he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Isn't it?" After Ravelston retired that evening, Eleanor went to the library. Ashworth was there with a glass of something he was not drinking. She sat down across from him and let the silence work. "He was looking for the report," she said. "Yes." "He will not find it. It is not in this house. I took it to the solicitor's office 3 weeks ago, along with a notarized copy and a letter of instruction detailing what should be done with it, if anything happens to the original." She watched the expression on his face go through several changes. Surprise, recognition, something that might have been alarm, and then something that looked like the first loosening of a weight, carried so long the carrier has forgotten what his shoulders felt like without it. "I am going to tell you something," she said, "and I would like you to listen before you respond, because I know your first instinct will be to refuse, and I am asking you not to refuse until you have heard me out." She told him. She laid out the plan with the same precision she brought to accounts. The solicitor's assessment, the legal strategy, the private confrontation that would force a retraction without a public trial. She explained how the evidence would be presented to Ravelston's own counsel in a way that left two choices: withdraw the accusation publicly, citing newly discovered information, or face full exposure. She explained how the Children's Trust Fund was legally protected regardless. She explained how Ravelston's wife would be offered quiet separation with financial provision. "The children are protected in every scenario," she said. "That was the first thing I established. The second is that you do not need to destroy yourself to protect them. That was never the only arithmetic available. You could not see another equation because you were inside it. He sat very still. She watched his jaw work, his throat move, his hands grip the chair arms, and then, slowly, release. "You did this," he said. "I did this. Without asking me." "If I had asked, you would have said no." "Yes. Because you do not count yourself among the people who deserve protecting." Eleanor. Her name, with the weight of everything accumulated between them. "I cannot ask you to do this." "You are not asking. I am telling you it is done." "Why?" His voice quiet and not entirely under control. "Why have you done this?" She said, "Because you sat on a nursery floor and told the child the world was large and she was small, and that was a perfectly reasonable thing to cry about. Because you made me tea and covered it with a saucer. Because you brought me a lamp. Because you stood in doorways. Because you showed me your mother's letter. Because you trusted me with your maps." She stopped. Her voice was no longer steady. "Because you matter. You have always mattered. And the arithmetic was never complete without you in it." The room was very quiet. The fire had burned low, and the careful face he had shown the world for 20 years opened entirely. Not with drama, not with collapse, but with the slow release of a man who has been bracing for so long, his muscles have forgotten anything else. He crossed the room. He stood in front of her and said, "Eleanor," and stopped, because there was nothing else the name did not already contain. And then, slowly, with the deliberate, careful precision that characterized everything he did, the Duke of Ashworth went to his knees. Not as a proposal, not as a performance. He went to his knees the way a man goes to his knees when he's been standing for 20 years and has found someone in whose presence he is allowed to stop. He knelt and took her hands and pressed his forehead against her fingers and stayed there. She freed one hand and placed it on his head, in his hair, which was warm from the fire and still needed cutting. She held him. The house breathed around them with the old, patient respiration of a building that has been waiting to become what it was becoming now. Ravelston was confronted in the solicitor's chambers on a late February morning, not by Ashworth, who Eleanor had persuaded with some difficulty to remain at the house, but by the solicitor himself, in the presence of Ravelston's own counsel, who had been quietly briefed, and whose face, upon reading Eleanor's report, took on the expression of a man recalculating how much his client has been lying to him. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Eleanor's 37 pages lay on the table like a hand of cards that cannot be beaten. Ravelston tried charm first, then indignation, then a desperate variant of reason. His own solicitor stopped him twice. The second time, he placed a hand on Ravelston's arm and said, quietly, that perhaps his lordship should listen to what was being proposed. A public retraction, published in the Times and read in the House of Lords, citing newly discovered evidence. The Children's Trust transferred to an independent trustee. Ravelston's wife offered quiet separation with provision. Ravelston himself to retire from public life. What happened to Ravelston's face, the solicitor later told Eleanor, was the most interesting thing he had observed in 30 years of practice. The slow, visible collapse of a man who has been performing confidence so long, he has forgotten what is underneath. He signed the retraction that afternoon. London recalibrated with the practiced efficiency of a stage crew changing sets. The invitations returned. White's found the usual table available. The hospital expressed delight, and Ashworth, standing in his library with the morning paper,
read the restored courtesies with an expression that was not triumph, but exhaustion. The final exhaustion of a man vindicated by a world whose opinion he had discovered mattered considerably less than he once believed. He put down the paper. He looked at Eleanor in the doorway. "It appears I am respectable again." "It appears." "London has decided who I am. Again." London was not consulted. The real smile appeared. No, it was not. He paused. "You were?" "Yes," she said. "I was." They married in June. The parish church, a handful of people, sunlight through the east windows making patterns on the stone floor that Clara tried to catch with her hands. Mrs. Cavendish attended in a hat of such architectural ambition, it required its own pew and the forbearance of everyone seated behind her. Mrs. Aldridge stood at the back in her best dress. Marsh produced the ring with immaculate timing. Foyle cried openly when Ashworth kissed Eleanor. Brief, gentle, unhurried. James tugged Clara's sleeve and said, with the satisfaction of someone whose data has been confirmed, "I told you, his face does, Eleanor." And Clara said, "Is there cake?" There was cake. Spring settled over London in the weeks that followed, arriving in fits and starts the way uncertain things often do, and Ashworth House underwent a transformation visible only in retrospect. There were flowers in every room now, not formal arrangements but real ones, collected from the garden by Clara and arranged in jars with the creative logic of a 3-year-old, which meant that one jar contained, memorably, a worm, included by James on the grounds that it was alive and therefore qualified. There were children's drawings on the library walls, in which Mrs. Aldridge was taller than the house, and everyone was smiling, which was not entirely inaccurate, which was the thing that made them art. There was laughter, which had been absent so long its return was startling. Running footsteps on the stairs. 2 voices in the library evenings that could sustain a silence as comfortably as a sentence. One evening in late June, Eleanor stood at the bedroom window looking out at the square. The light was the long, golden light of a London summer evening, the kind that has no urgency in it, that exists for no purpose other than to illuminate whatever it touches with the generous warmth of a world that is, for this particular moment, enough. Behind her, Ashworth was reading the agricultural book she had given him at Christmas, which had become, through rereading and shared argument, as much a record of their history as the accounts that had started it. Clara's doll was on the chair by the door. James's puzzle sat on the mantelpiece, beside a small, grey, perfectly ordinary stone that Clara had given Eleanor the day they met in the hallway, and which Eleanor had kept, and which sat there now among the candlesticks and the clock and the ordinary objects of a room that had become, after a long time and against considerable odds, simply home. She turned from the window. He looked up from his book. Their eyes met across the room that belonged to both of them now. "Come to bed," she said. He closed the book. He crossed the room to where she stood. His face did the thing it had learned to do. It opened. It did her name. "Yes," he said. The candle on the mantelpiece guttered in a breath of wind from the open window. The stone sat beside it, grey and plain and perfect. Outside, the evening held its last light over the rooftops and the city that had tried to decide who he was and gotten it wrong, as cities do, because cities deal in reputation, and the truest things, the blanket over sleeping shoulders, the child held at 4 a.m, the quiet words in a library, are almost never seen by anyone except the person they are meant for. The house settled into its evening silence. Somewhere in the nursery, Clara slept with her rabbit in one hand
and the other hand open, palm up, the way children sleep when they are not afraid, completely, with the trust of someone who knows that the people downstairs are staying, that the doors are locked, that the fires are lit, and that this place is home. Thank you for staying with us tonight, for giving your time to these two people who found each other through patience and honesty and the courage of ordinary days. If it reminded you of something, of someone, of a kindness given or received, of the quiet power of simply being seen, then it did what it was meant to do. We will be here again soon,